In the House of Commons. Good evening. First, I just say who I am. I'm Tony Travers. I'm the Interim Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the LSE, and I've got the happy opportunity to chair this event this evening. The event is entitled LSE Director and Friends, Our Lifelong Network, and it'll become clear soon enough why that's been chosen as the title for this excellent LSE Civil Service, Government and Public Policy Alumni Group evening. There is a hashtag, so it is on the record. It's a public event, so you can tweet there. It will be recorded and available as a podcast. I just want to say 2 or 3 words before I introduce Minouche, our director. We all know LSE has a history going back to 1895. It's a long history. And many thousands of alumni, former staff members and friends still gather in the LSE's name on a regular basis to meet, to stay in touch, and to benefit from each other's experience. And this evening is particularly about that latter idea. It's a group of friends who've stayed in touch. We'll hear more about them and from them in a moment, so I'm going to say no more than that now. But first, it gives me great pleasure to invite Dame Minouche Shafik, our director, who is going to make a Distinguished Alumni Leadership Award, but I'll leave her to say who. It'll like the Oscars. I'm getting ahead of it myself, so Minouche.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome to all of you. So alumni are the LSE's greatest ambassadors, and their achievements after they graduate from the school are a source of huge pride. And the fact that so many go on to do great things reflects incredibly well on the school. We agree that we have 18 Nobel laureates among the alumni, but we have a running debate about whether it's 34 or 52 prime ministers and presidents. If you read Wikipedia, it says 52, but our office says 34, and we can't agree. But anyway, it's a lot. And this evening, I'm particularly delighted to recognize an outstanding alumni volunteer award for Alan Elias in recognition of outstanding volunteer services to the school, more or less since when he graduated. He was a student at the school between 1974 and 77 as an undergraduate in the law department. And he has also served as acting chair and vice chair of our board, our governing body, which is called our council. He's a former partner of the law firm of Clifford Chance. He's also a magistrate for Central London and practices as a commercial mediator. Since Alan has stepped down from Clifford Chance, he has done a variety of things, including serve as a trustee at a community health charity based in Islington. He's a mentor to many small businesses and charities and social enterprises. But most important to us, he continues to be engaged with the school. He's an ambassador for the law department. He sponsors a law student scholarship. He gives career advice. He mentors several of our students and participates widely in our widening participation and fundraising efforts. He's been closely involved with the governance of the school for over 12 years. And I am personally particularly grateful because he was involved in the process of hiring me. So I'd like to think he has fantastic judgment, but anyway, I have to live up to his expectations. So Alan, if I could ask you to come up and receive this award. Really well deserved. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. And over to you, Tony.
And over to our colleagues.
I think we'll okay, so I'm in the middle.
I'll sit here if I might.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, check it. It's Laing, isn't it? Double check.
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, hello again. We've now got a part of the evening. Let me explain what's going to happen. I'm not going to introduce each of our distinguished colleagues here, but I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And thereafter, I'm going to begin a conversation. My suspicion is I won't have to get it going very much, given the conversation we were having a moment ago outside. And then in about 40 minutes or so, I'll open it up so you can ask questions tailored to the spirit of the evening. And then we'll finish around 8:25, 8:30, and then there'll be an opportunity to have a drink outside. So as I said, I'll just give everybody's name, but I'm not going to go further than that. So the group assembled here this evening, and perhaps I can then first ask Minouche to explain perhaps the origin of this evening and the group, but then that'll come a bit later. So we've got Philip Barton, Sir Jeremy Heywood, Catriona Laing, Dame Minouche Shafik, and Keith Wade. But I'm going to ask each of them, starting, just going round perhaps from Jeremy here on my immediate left, just to say a little bit about what they did at the LSE and what they've done since. I mean, we know in many of your cases, but Jeremy.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I studied a Master's in Economics at the LSE from 1985 to 1986, like the rest of us. It was always a bit of a puzzle because there were two master's degrees in economics, there probably still are, Economics 1 and Economics 2. And the only difference was that number 2 was significantly harder than number 1. It was always completely impossible to understand why anyone did number 2, but nevertheless, we all did number 1, and we sort of fluked it through. So we did that for a bit. I went back to the Treasury. I was a civil servant. I was very unusual in the sense that I was on full pay when I was here, having already done 2 years of work in the civil service. But my obligation in a sense, although it was never set out in a legal contract, was I had to go back to the civil service, which I did very happily. And I basically stayed in the civil service for most of my career since then. But I had a short spell out at Morgan Stanley, the investment bank. At which point the LSE noticed that I existed. Very surprisingly.
Well done, alumni relations.
Very surprisingly. Having ignored me for years, suddenly they were fascinated by what was happening in my career. But after about 4 years doing that, I went back into government, worked for Gordon Brown, and then I'm now Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service. We can talk about that later.
Okay, certainly. Minouche.
Yes, so I also, we were all together in the same study group in 1986, so we got together, maybe I'll tell that story later about how we got together. But so I did the MSc in Economics, MSc 1 definitely, plus the September prep course to bone up on the maths that I was ill prepared for. And then after the LSE, I actually went on and did my PhD in Oxford and then joined the World Bank and spent a long time, 15 years at the World Bank, and then came back to the UK to join the civil service to be at DFID. I was at DFID for 7 years. Catriona and I worked together there. Philip and I would encounter each other at Whitehall meetings in the Cabinet Office at the time. And you're reminding me, I came and visited you in Pakistan when you were ambassador there. And then after DFID, I went to the IMF, was Deputy Managing Director during the Eurozone crisis, Bank of England, and then LSE.
Great. Philip.
So my memory is I was in Warwick University wanting to be doing economics and wanted to be an academic, and my father didn't think that was a proper job. So I thought, okay, I'll apply for the Foreign Office. They won't let me in because I didn't go to Oxbridge, and I'll apply to LSE for a master's course, which is what I really wanted to do. To my surprise, the Foreign Office offered me a job. So then I said, well, can you defer it for a year? Thinking, well, I'll just do the Masters and then counting a PhD and forget about the Foreign Office. Ended up on the course, doing the one, the easy bit. Actually found it quite hard, even though it was the one, and despite the study group. So thought, okay, I'll join the Foreign Office. And I have been a career diplomat ever since. I've had 6 overseas postings, I think mostly designed to provide holiday destinations for other members of the study group. I mean, Minouche was the only one who came on holiday, well, she wasn't for work actually, to Pakistan, but you know, starting in Venezuela, going through Cyprus, India, Gibraltar. I think most of the others did come and see at various destinations around the world. And I've also done some interesting jobs in London on international issues for government, but outside of the Foreign Office itself in the centre, but I'm now back in the Foreign Office.
Great. Catriona.
So I actually spent 2 years at LSE because I did the preliminary year MSc, which set me up reasonably well, but it was still a tough year, the actual master's course. I always knew I wanted to work in international development, and this was so quite a deliberate move on my part because I wanted to apply for an ODI fellowship, Overseas Development Institute Fellowship, which is a program for postgraduate economists to work in developing countries. And another member of our study group, sadly, who couldn't be here today, Rachel Turner, had told me all about the fellowship. And she had been in Botswana, and she said, if you do the ODI fellowship, you have to go to Botswana, which is exactly what I did. And I was in the Ministry of Works, Transport and Communications. It was a wonderful 2.5 years, got me completely hooked on Africa, where I have spent most of my career. I've worked in Kenya, sort of veered off into some of the conflict zones, Somalia and Sudan, then diverted off to Afghanistan for a while to work for the NATO mission in Helmand. I've also moved around Whitehall quite a bit. Most of my career was in DFID, but I spent 5 years at the Cabinet Office working in Tony Blair's strategy unit, and then 3 years as the International Director of the Ministry of Justice. For Helmand, I was working for the Foreign Office, and I then decided I would like to try and transfer in. So I bid for the Ambassador to Zimbabwe job, was successful, and I'm now sort of fully fledged diplomat, somewhat to my surprise. And it's been a fun and interesting career.
Keith, fine.
Yeah,
Last but not least.
I was working at the London Business School, and it became clear that if I was going to have a career as an economist, I needed to have a master's degree. And the LBS, actually, the guy running it, Alan Budd, said, well, you could go and do your master's degree and carry on working for LBS. I thought this was quite a good deal, although I think it was actually a better deal for LBS than for me. But, so I was here from 85 to 87, and I'd done my first degree here, actually, from 80 to 83. So I did know quite a bit about the LSE setup and so on. So I did that. I did Economics 1 as well, which was a good move. But when I finished, I was obliged to go back to LBS. So I did another year at LBS and did some more research on trade and financial markets and so on. And then it was Big Bang in the city. This was in the 80s. And I think out of about the 12 people in our team, I think about 8 of them went into the city at that time. And that was the path to take. And I became UK economist at Schroders then, which was very domestically focused. And I was doing the UK, and I did that for a while. But of course, as Schroders grew, we became much more international. I became the chief economist. I have a team of people working with me. And I probably spend a lot of my time now doing international economics and asset allocation are the two things I'm most involved in. And like a lot of economists, spend a lot of time talking to clients and doing quite a lot of sort of talking head stuff with the media and all that kind of thing. So still as engaging as ever. I still think the markets are the biggest challenge that you can probably face as an economist. Certainly the regularity of the questions that you get asked and getting proved wrong quite a lot of the time. But that's where I am.
Great. Well, that's a really nice way of beginning the evening. I'm sure we can talk more about some of these things that brought you to the school. But what can I just ask, whichever you'd like to go first? What was the reputation of the school at the time? Generally, not just as an academic institution. What did people think about it when you said, "I'm thinking of going to the LSE rather than anywhere else"? What was it that, what was the reputation of the place? I mean, it's got a long-term reputation, but at the time, it was nearer the 60s than it is today, and so on and so on. So what did people make of it?
Well, when I did my first degree in 1980, when you said you were going to the LSE, they thought you were basically going to be going on protests and and all the rest of it. That was the impression.
But of course, drivers still think that.
And they do. But of course, the actual economics that you were taught was quite market.
Yeah, very neoclassical.
But certainly doing the masters. When I was at LBS, we used to organise seminars, and Mervyn King came along a couple of times. And, he's a great teacher, and I always thought, well, it'd be quite nice to do his course, Yep. So that was an opportunity. It was one of the reasons I applied to do the masters here. So
an individual...
In terms of academic reputation, it was definitely seen as, in the top tier then, there's 2 or 3, 5, in the country. When I was thinking at Warwick, I want to do economics at master's level, setting aside the protest stuff, academic reputation was very strong.
And as Keith says, with this fascinating curiosity that it's economists, despite the reputation of the school politically, economists were quite sort of free market.
Yes.
Quite,
I mean, when we were studying, do you remember it was the rational expectations revolution?
Oh, yeah. God,
Oh
yeah.
my God, and we spent the whole time solving those bloody rational expectations models, which were highly mathematical and quite, you know, Chicago schooly
Very much,
view
yeah.
of the world.
Chicago schooly.
And that's what we were taught.
And I chose it deliberately because doing development, I was advised you'll be, you know, seem to be very fluffy, so you need to compensate for that by being very hard-nosed, macro, econometric. So it worked from my point of view.
Yeah, it's a similar reaction in a way, and that's obviously correct in relation to the macro course and so on. My special subject was labour economics, Richard Layard. And I don't think Richard would ever see himself as on that wing of the economics profession. And in fact, I think he probably was instrumental in setting up the SDP while we were
Yes, he was recruiting. He tried to recruit all of us. Do you remember? Charter for Jobs. Remember that?
Exactly, Charter for Jobs. So the labour economics course, anyway, was definitely sort of, you know, mainstream or sort of slightly left of centre, if anything, you can put it like that with economics. But overall, I mean, I'd been trying to think about going to the London School of Economics since 1981, 4 years before. But such was its reputation, and so difficult was it to get a grant in those days, you know, let alone today, obviously, that, you know, I was basically told, I was at Oxford at the time, that, you know, you wouldn't necessarily, even if you got a first-class degree from Oxford, you wouldn't necessarily have much of a chance as a Brit getting into the LSE. So that's the reason why I ended up joining the civil service, actually. I'd always wanted to go to the LSE because of its reputation as probably the best place to study economics in the country. But it was seen as really difficult to get into, and, you know, just very prestigious from an economics perspective.
and the civil service, to its credit, I think you said this, it allowed you to do this while in post. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, yeah, it was a slightly complicated thing in that I thought I was applying for what was called a cadetship. I think we've abolished them since because of the cuts. You know, which would have allowed you to do a sort of sponsored course. In fact, I got accepted as an economist in the civil service, but the deal was I would do that for a couple of years and then I'd actually go and learn some economics.
Right.
Because I didn't really feel as I knew enough in economics to actually advise ministers about that.
And what we all, I mean, and again, whichever wants to go, first impressions. I mean, perhaps there were second impressions in some cases, but first impressions either on this occasion or before of the place, because London was a scruffier place at the time. The LSE's always prided itself on, I mean, not this building obviously, which is a big step in the right direction away from that, but the sort of, you know, with elements of scruffiness that people always rather treasured. I mean, was that how it felt?
Yes.
It was definitely scruffy.
I mean, it was much scruffier than now. I mean, this
isn't scruffy.
Nothing like this.
It's fantastic. But I mean, the old theatre was, I mean, that's still there, I guess. I don't know if that's been refurbished
Unchanged.
Since, but, you know, that must have been like it was since the 1950s, when we were there in the 80s.
There's a plaque up celebrating the RAF using it during the Second World War since then. That's been added, actually. But but as a physical setup, but did you enjoy it, though, as a sort of, in its sort of LSE way? The
Not
room,
really,
the
no.
buildings? No. Oh, no.
It was very shabby, very scruffy, terrible food.
It was terrible. Oh, the food, it was terrible. And
The food was
Tell us
terrible.
about the food.
lots of chips.
Oh, right.
Well, it was chips
that was
with
the highlight,
something.
no.
It was chips with something. And we used to hang out in Wright's bar.
Wright's bar.
Remember?
Wright's bar.
Wright's
Yeah.
bar,
That's
smoke-filled at the
Yeah.
time.
Smoke-filled, including by some
Can't
of
think why.
Yes.
And try and drag Jeremy from the library to go for a drink at the 3 Tons.
Yes.
That's true. I was always
we
in the
always
library.
used to have to
Jeremy-
negotiate
yeah,
what
Jeremy-
time Jeremy
yeah,
would
the-
leave, and we could all leave the library to go for a drink. And there's a sort of bidding process.
The basic purpose of the study group was to get Jeremy's notes. That's the true confession. So
I tell you what, just remember, we turn up, especially I came from Warwick, and I thought it was quite a mathematical course at Warwick. I came here, first thing we had to do was a 1 month boot camp in August. I don't think everyone did it, but to get our maths up to scratch.
Right.
And I think, blimey, wow, this is actually quite hard. So that was my first reaction. Is academically, it is
tough.
in a good way tough. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to take this seriously. So finding some fellow people, especially ones I could copy and help study with, was quite a key objective for the
Secrets
starting off.
already.
Yeah.
So we've got here already. Where do you remember how you first met, or who met whom first? And I mean, do you
question.
where it all began?
I think it probably
It's a
began
study
in the
group.
coffee bar in between lectures and just a kind of natural, I'm tempted to say use the word congregation, but just a natural sort of coming together in between lectures and just chatting and, you know, as you do at the start of the course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the really difficult question is how Minouche fitted it, because the rest of us were all British. You know, the sea of foreign students, many of whom became very good friends, obviously.
Yeah.
But at the start, you know, the Brits
true.
sort of clung together, and I sort of quickly found a couple of other people who the civil service had been involved with, including Philip and a guy called Derek. I don't know if Derek's here, but Derek Ridyard, and the missing member. You know, like the fifth Beatle. But anyway, so we sort of quickly spotted these are the ill-dressed Brits. So we sort of hung together. And this rather sophisticated. Impossible to work out how old she was, which country she was coming from. Just had an immense career behind her already. And claimed only to be 21. Claimed to be British, was in fact American, or was it Egyptian? Somehow she sort of tagged along. But that was basically it, wasn't it? We were the Brits.
But I think, I mean, Catriona, you had a lot of the connections. I seem to remember your
Well, she was the
network.
social
She's a
secretary.
Londoner.
Social
She was
secretary.
the social secretary of our MSc class. Right?
Well, Keith was the chair.
Yes.
And I was the social secretary.
So what was the division of labour implied by this?
And well, the power behind the throne was Jeremy, of course. As ever.
Even
Plus ça
then.
change, because they say
Even then.
But keep going about
the
the
puppet government.
Outrageous.
Right, we better stay
Katrina
on the
used to
social secretary in the
organise,
80s for the
used to
moment.
organise.
I did a lot of, yeah, that was my other, in between, you know, the hard work. And so we did have a lot of social events, and I was my job to organise them and try and get people to come down to where I was working at the time, which was the Academy in Brixton, which was my job, so to earn some money.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But we had some good parties, and yeah, I got the music together. You know, those days you used to make a little tape for all the music, and yeah, we had a lot of fun, actually. The social secretary side was a very important part of my real.
And was there anything other than social? I mean, it's what else? What
We
was the
we
chair
organised
doing?
an event actually, which was a careers evening,
Right.
and that was, well, surprisingly successful
Yeah.
actually. So we wrote to a number of companies and said, you know, we're all doing the MSc at LSE, you know, would you like to come to our evening and present, you know, what it's like to have a career? And we charged them for the privilege of doing
that's
so.
right, yeah.
I mean, it was something like it was only about £10 or something. And but the
Only in which, or £10
Well, that
then,
was
or
in
£10 now? Yes, so
1985
nominal,
money, so-
nominal £10. Right.
And I can say that the only group that didn't pay and still haven't paid are the civil servants. So
Tough time in the mid-80s.
That's right.
perhaps we could take that up.
But you
later.
had an income. The rest of us were,
Yeah.
were quite poor. You were. That's why we kept wanting you to go to the.
It's obvious
Get
why
out
I
of the
was
library.
It's quite obvious why I was in the group. Keith was actually our leader in all normal respects, and we wanted a sort of Blairite figure, suave,
Blairite banker, no less.
you know, banker, you know, someone who could obviously appeal to all parts of the community, and he was the obvious candidate.
Now, before we started, I can't remember which of you got this going, but you were reminding each other of particular examples from, as it were, examples of how to make, to explain economic issues. The ice cream. Who did the ice? It was you, wasn't it?
So the one
Do this.
theory-
Go and remind us
to be
of
honest,
this.
I mean, the one thing about me is I joined the Foreign Office and haven't actually ever worked as an economist. So it's always been useful to blind people in the Foreign Office. Done ancient Greek as their degree of it. I know a bit of knowledge, but I've never worked it on. The one theorem I remember is, for the microeconomists in the audience, is Schmalensee's theorem
Anybody remember?
about the ice cream sellers on the beach. Lots of blank faces. I'm going to carry on anyway. So you've got a beach, and you've got a perfect set of people are lined up along the beach who all want an ice cream, and you have two ice cream sellers selling the same ice cream for the same price. So they're basically competing for a number of people on the beach. And the reason why people go to one or the other is how far you have to walk, because it's baking hot. And wherever they start on the beach, they both end up in the middle, because what happens is if one moves, the other jumps the other side and captures more than half the beach. So they iterate to the middle, which is optimal for them because they are guaranteed half the custom. Is suboptimal for the ice cream buyers because that's not the best place in terms of minimising the amount of distance they have to walk. So it shows that, you know, markets don't always work. And it's all really interesting. We had to learn 4 pages of algebra to reproduce Schroders in an exam, which I certainly can't remember. And I just thought it was all very interesting, but actually, you know, whatever, because it's so unreal. But actually, I then found in the real world, you do see examples of Schmalenz's theorem. So, you know, when I was posted in Cyprus Airways, British Airways, those days, state regulation, the only 2 airlines flying between Larnaca and London. Same sort of thing. They didn't really compete on price, and they both, one left at 3:30 a.m. and the other left at 3:45 a.m. And they knew they were going to get half the market. And for the consumers, it was a nightmare. You know, you had to get up in the middle of the night. So Schmalenz's theorem works.
Very good. The economics. And there was another one that what was the other?
Market for lemons.
Market for lemons.
The market for lemons. Let's do that as well. Go on. What we've got here.
This is Akerlof and Yellen paper.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and they're married to each other.
They are married.
Apparently. Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, actually, Minouche will probably correct me on this, but
No.
I mean, it's another example of market failure. Having said how much LSE is very pro-markets, the 2 papers we remember are where the market's broken down. So, you know, the idea is obviously supply and demand. As the price goes up for something, the demand goes down. Whereas this paper tried to prove the other way around in the market for second-hand cars, which, you know, Americans call a Duff second-hand car a lemon. So the price was the means of signalling that the car was actually of good quality. So in this case, the higher the price, the more people thought it was a better quality car, so the demand went up. So it was kind of an inverted yield curve. Inverted demand curve.
Not really a yield curve.
Sorry, that's too much.
It's been in the city too long.
Because these days, of course, this would all be an argument for, you know, and the LSE now studies this, of course, the regulation of ice cream or indeed this kind of lemons. But, I mean, when you met in your group, I mean, presumably some of it was chatting about this sort of stuff, but I mean, give a flavour of what you would do then and when you'd meet and all of that.
Well, I remember we used to annotate papers because there was so much reading and there was no way to keep up. And there was this myth, I don't know if it's true, but there was a myth at the time that the LSE failed 40% of the master's class. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
We were all petrified.
We were given these worksheets and we were really told, if you don't do your worksheets, you will fail.
Right.
So we spent a bit of time sitting down trying to do these blinking worksheets.
Exactly. And annotate. So one of us would read the article and summarize it and share the notes around with the other. Do you remember that? That was mainly Jeremy. But
You remember this?
I don't actually, no. I've been sort of betrayed here as some sort of swot. No, I read my lecture notes at the end of, you know, most people just brought tape recorders along actually and just sort of plonked the tape recorder down in front, and then that was the sort of end of it. So what I used to do was to take my notes, read them in the library, rewrite them, and actually make sure I'd understood them. And at that point, the study actually became fairly straightforward. But
For Jeremy.
Everybody else agree with that?
No.
No. I remember you finding an error in a paper.
Yeah.
oh God, do you remember that?
And which has been I
Yeah.
think it was a Boiter paper or something, and you found an error in it somewhere in a footnote.
And it was macroeconomics. You know, we had the first term I think was looked at closed economies, and the second term was international macroeconomics, and it was Michael Bruno and Jeffrey Sachs's work and their book, which is very interesting and very good, but basically for lesser mortals incomprehensible. And so we relied on Jeremy's interpretation skills to try, and we sat with that. But that I think the thing that really sticks in my mind from this study group, which was trying to work out this model, the two did, which then actually was the core of the exam when we did the macroeconomics paper. You had to understand it. And I remember walking out of the exam with Jeremy and the others and chatting about what we'd done on question 3 or whatever, and just suddenly realising I'd moved this curve the wrong way. And anyway, I didn't fail, but
Yeah,
about the Bruno and Sachs model.
it's like, you know, they always say the best way to learn is to teach. So this was really a
Yeah.
teaching group. So yeah, somebody would lead on a particular topic. It's a bit of division of labour, as you said, Minouche, because there was so much to cover. And then by requiring, because you have to explain it, you would then understand it much better. It was a good technique.
Yes,
and
it
it did
was.
work.
It did work for us.
We
We all
just
passed.
made it a bit more fun, and we always
Yeah.
knew. In my case, I would my eye on the clock. You know, the bar was waiting for me.
That's always true. And, I mean, two of you have gone into the Foreign Office. I mean, economics, Foreign Office, not an obvious step. I mean, you might have done IR or something, but how has the economics helped you in a job in the sort of international postings that you've both had?
So I suspect Catriona and I have different answers. So I originally wanted to do a PhD, but just decided not to. I thought I'll join the Foreign Office and I'll give it 10 years. So I didn't join as an economist. But the thing I've always found is two things. One is, I think, especially when you get to master's level, economics gives you an ability to construct frameworks and make sense of the world. So whatever you're trying to order in your mind and make sense of, it just is useful. The second is, behind most, not all, but most politics is economics. Yeah. And our job is about going to other countries and understanding them and then using that understanding in pursuit of the UK interest. And, you know, if you go and talk to a politician in another country, you know, they do want to talk about international stuff, but actually they're more interested in what gets them elected, and that's about domestic stuff, and a lot of that is about economics. So it is genuinely useful, although I don't do economics, having an economic understanding really helped me in my job all the way through.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Catriona.
Yeah, so similar, but I mean, my route was slightly different. So, as I said, I always wanted to work in development, particularly in Africa, and I'd got good advice that economics was the best route into that. So it enabled me to get my ODI fellowship, and then I joined the civil service through the GES, the Government Economic Service. So that was my route in. And I stayed working as a junior economist and then a senior economist for quite some time. So I did keep with the economics, and it was incredibly interesting, actually, working in, for example, Kenya. In the old ODA, we used to do the project appraisals ourselves, you know, and so you actually having those frameworks to understand opportunity cost and choice and how a government allocates resources. As you said, it's how a government functions, basically. But I never wanted to stay purely in the economics route. It was a means to an end for me. But I think as my career has developed, what I've found is it's the political economy that you have to really understand. You know, follow the money, see how, you know, elites make decisions. And if you have the economics piece, and that's, I think, the Foreign Office needs to understand that it's really important. It's not just a nice to have. I think to actually do our jobs these days, to understand how these economies and politics functions, it's the joining of the two, politics and economics.
I mean, I know you're not in the Foreign Office, the rest of it. I mean, the Home Civil Service, I mean, presumably the same logic of having an understanding of the principles of economics and the dynamics that in turn explains about the way the economy, but actually more than the economy, because some of these principles work beyond economics in some ways, don't they? Is that true in the Home Civil Service?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, look, but also, I think to a greater extent in the Home Civil Service than the Foreign Office, we have a number of quite specialist economic jobs as well. I mean, obviously, a place like the Treasury has got lots of economists. So I spent quite a bit of my career doing quite economics jobs. Probably most, actually, funnily enough, my 2 years at the IMF was probably the most intense use of the economics that I made the most intense use of the economics I learnt at the LSE. But you really did. I mean, in those days, I think in the IMF you had to have a PhD to join in economics to join the IMF. I didn't have that, but you know, having a very good master's degree from the LSE was absolutely essential if you were going to hold your own with the staff and be able to critique their work and actually suggesting to them that they should do differently. But you know, whether it's during the ERM crisis in the Treasury or during the financial crisis under Gordon Brown, when we were trying to work out how to save the banking system and the economy and what sort of measures might stimulate the economy to stop us sliding into a Great Depression. I mean, that's a lot of pure economics. And being able to digest sort of ideas that came forward from people on QE, for example, you actually needed to understand the principles of economics pretty thoroughly to be able to sort of engage in the discussion. But even outside the sort of specialist area, as Philip and Catriona have said, actually being able to understand the framework and be able to understand what economists are saying. I mean, I did a big review of the Treasury in the mid-1990s, and in the end, persuaded the microeconomists in the Treasury to sort of bed themselves out into the individual policy teams. And that was a marriage made in heaven in a way, because from the economist perspective, it brought them much closer to being able to advise on policy, which is what ministers were interested in, but they're bringing their analytical skills to bear. And equally, the policy people who hadn't got economics degrees realised this was a really high quality group of people who are trained to a very high level, who are very rigorous with evidence. And, as you'll know with your School of Public Policy and so on, there's increasing focus now on evidence-based policy making, which, in many respects depends upon econometrics and economics, because that's basically what the evidence is.
And you've now got economists much more distributed across Whitehall than in the past, where there might be one in a department, as I remember it, who used to think of themselves as a bit isolated. And I used to have a friend who was a chief economist in a department. He used to think, they all thought he was a bit odd, really. But now, economics is much more embedded across Whitehall, is that?
Yeah, I think it is, but there is still the need for the Government Economics Service to bring the economists together.
Right.
When I first joined the civil service, before the LSE, I was one of 2 economists in the Health and Safety Executive. We certainly felt very isolated there, surrounded by factory inspectors and nuclear scientists, and just two people who cared about how much it cost to put some of the safety regulation in place, as opposed to how many, what sort of benefits it would save. But
cost-benefit analysis, indeed. Minouche, you worked in government and in the bank, and actually elsewhere. So, all right.
Well, so I worked, when I was at the World Bank and the IMF, those were 2 institutions dominated by economists. So, the IMF has 800 PhDs in economics, the World Bank has over 1,000. The whole ethos of the organization thinks like an economist. DFID was different, and DFID was the first time I had to work with a much wider array of skills, because if anything, DFID is a slightly more social policy dominated culture. And then I went to the Bank of England, which is
more economists.
Yeah, more economists. So I've been sort of surrounded by economists for most of my career, except at DFID.
So I didn't mean to stop you. I'm just catching Keith's eye. So do you want to? Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you.
No.
Right.
That's it.
No, I was very similar kind of answer, really. It's about a framework. But in the markets, a lot of my job is partly sort of trying to anticipate where interest rates are going and so on. And so, of course, with central banks very dominated by economists, if you're somebody who is an economist, you can try and think in the same way. Yeah. So, that was really the advantage you had. And very often you felt that, particularly in markets from trading and things moving very rapidly, you're probably the only sort of rational, calm voice by trying to say something about what's actually happening and what's going on. But really trying to give that perspective of how the central bank might think about what's happened if the pound has fallen very sharply, how they're going to react to that and so on. So that was really where my sort of work as an economist in the city kind of comes through. And we've all been at the same college, we all think in a similar way.
But, I want to come back to something Catriona said, which is, in the end, it's the political economy that matters the most. So when I think about, even the very technical jobs that one did at the IMF or the World Bank, it was that interplay between politics and economics that was the most useful framework to have. And, for me, I originally started off thinking I was more interested in politics, but the more I studied politics, the more I realized there was economics behind them. And so in the real world, it's that combination.
I think financial markets are just waking up to that, actually, because, that's the big change that, there's been a sort of Washington consensus about everything for a long time, and you could, anticipate what was going on. But now, of course, with populism and so on, you're having to anticipate things like, what's going to happen in Italy, for example, under the populist government and so on, and, what's Trump's policies going to do? What are they going to lead to, and so on? So
political economy, what we're coming around to is a massive vote of support for the understanding of political economy. That is the understanding of economics put alongside the understanding of politics, so that the rigour of the one can be used to inform decisions made in the other. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I agree.
And with this in mind, there are criticisms of the way economics is taught, and I don't want to go off especially in the London School of Economics and Political Science, but do you ever hear criticisms of the way economics is taught and learned these days, that those who teach and learn it should know more about? Don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but anybody want to?
Obviously, there's a huge literature now on, why did economics not predict the financial crash, and
the Queen asked in this very building.
This very building.
Yes, exactly.
I wouldn't say that's particularly influenced very much the way in which we look at it inside government, to be honest. We continue to sort of get advice from probably more mainstream voices than some of the people who are radically critiquing the economics profession. I don't think the radical critique has yet sort of developed into something which can provide significant input into what we're doing. You try and listen to a wider variety of voices. You try not to get too... We've become very much more humble, frankly, about trying to do our own forecast, for example, in government. So we've sort of outsourced that and tried to make that... the OBR has been, I think, a successful innovation. The Bank of England, so basically just trying to be more transparent about the assumptions you're using and trying to, encourage, more debate around that, I guess, is the way in which we've responded. But undoubtedly, there are major questions about the inability of economics to predict, mainstream economics to predict turning points.
Yep, Philip, then I want to come back to
I
that.
think, I talked about frameworks.
Yep.
Which are brilliant, but if you pick the wrong framework, you're going to make a mistake. So I think we have got better at saying, okay, we picked that framework, that probably is the right one, but let's do some red team, or whatever you want to call it, some challenge, and before we take a big decision, let's think about, could it be this framework instead, and really test that, maybe even set us, if it's a really big thing, set aside a different group of people to think about it, and just in the end, you take a more robust decision. It's not completely foolproof, but I think we have got better at that. I think if you look at the way we've tried in government to learn from perhaps where things haven't gone as well as they might have done, I think it is about, as Jeremy says, bringing in the other voices and the wider thing, even if the end, more often than not, you'll end back on your central framework or thesis and take a decision.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to add, I think one of the problems there is that, economists always start off by making a lot of assumptions around the model and then run with the model. Yeah. And then it's about all the conclusions that come from the model. And you kind of almost forget about the assumptions that were made at the beginning. And you're left with, outcomes that, clearly people have not been happy with, which is why voting has changed. And, markets have delivered efficient outcomes, but a lot of people have been left behind. And they don't think that's...
economy again.
And I think that's the challenge for the economics, the academics.
Having said that, Oriana Bandera, who's one of our economists here at the LSE, often says, the London tube map is a model. It's a simplification of the reality. And if the tube map looked like the streets of London actually look, nobody could figure out how to use the tube. It would be so complicated. And so you do need simplification in order to have understanding. But you just can't forget that you have simplified.
Yes.
And you have made assumptions about which bits are... so I think that's a good analogy.
But, given we're sitting in the LSE, and you all know it intimately, what message would you like to send out to those who teach economics or write economics textbooks that they could now... we started in this conversation here, but now do differently or get better, or, to make certainly those in government on the other side of the political economy line feel that this was more attuned to the needs of modern government or indeed modern banking.
I think the point that Keith just made is very important, which is all models are very assumption specific. And actually, when we were at the LSE, we were just beginning to actually bring into the mainstream curriculum what happened if you varied some of the assumptions about perfect information and so on. So quite a lot of the more complicated mathematical courses we had to do were precisely, and they were much more. It was much more difficult mathematics, which is probably why there was only a tentative footstep or two into this field. But when you start, as I say, removing the assumption of perfect information, perfect symmetry, and all that, costless information gathering, you get very different results from the same models. But people tended to forget that. And I think recently, actually the biggest trend in economics that I'm aware of anyway is the rise of behavioural economics and the dropping of the assumption that human beings are rational. And as soon as you drop that assumption, then most of your economic results go out of the window. You start with completely different. So it's just being very clear about what your assumptions are and what happens if you change them.
And also the rise of big data and the fact that let's not use a model, let's see what the data tell us. And the ability to do sort of massive computing and in order to try and understand human behavior. We didn't have that when we were undergrad. Did we have laptops? We didn't have laptops. We didn't have anything. We didn't have computers.
The internet hasn't really started.
But actually, it's an interesting question. So the
big data revolution, I think, is also transforming the way we think about economics.
And is the data revolution in the hands of economists, I wonder? Because I get the impression some of the time it's in the hands of people from different disciplines. I mean, an economist are going to have to adapt to big data. Is that true? I mean, I look across
We've set up a big data unit in Schroders, and it's staffed full of statisticians and people who've never done any economics.
Yes.
So, but actually, that in some ways has made us realise the value of economics. So at least that's what I tell my bosses. Because the thing with big data is you can get data on anything.
Yeah.
And the problem is there's a real kind of wood for the trees problem.
Yeah.
And they'll collect all this data. We can get all this data on consumer spending in every shop in the UK.
Yeah.
Well, how do you get it into a format that you can actually use?
Yes. You need some theory.
It's a real challenge.
Yeah, but if you do it properly, you end up with the hypothesis following the data rather than the data sort of, franking the hypothesis you started with. So, if it's done properly, data science, I think, can give you some genuinely new insights. You don't have to start with a theory, which you then test against the data, but you start the other way around.
I think, exactly. And I think the thing that maybe LSE, I don't know because I'm not close to how teaching is done now, but starting much earlier with interdisciplinary type approach to teaching, and which business schools have moved into. I also did an MBA, and it was when I did it, it was quite old-fashioned and quite siloed, but it's much more integrated now. So then I think, as Jeremy said, the key is, can you get the right question? Is your hypothesis right? And you're much more likely to get that if you have a broad approach with different disciplines. And that's one of the strengths, I think, of DFID, is that it's got specialists in a whole range of different disciplines. And if you apply that well, you should get to a better question, at least.
Okay, I think we've come to an interesting point. I'm going to turn to the audience in a moment, but it's interesting that we've sort of come to an intriguing point in the conversation where, in a sense, we've started to open up the idea that although economics will always be economics, there are now these things like scale of data and the capacity to analyse it and behavioural economics, which are beginning to, if not chip away at, but are influencing like big magnets on the core of the discipline. But in a more personal way, before I open it up to the audience, I mean, how do you're here this evening, do you sort of keep in touch from time to time? And, can you give us a sense broadly how you do that? I mean, sort of...
Yeah, we do. We're actually very good friends. And we have been pretty much continuously. We've had some ups and downs. But
More than 30 years.
But you sort of meet when you're...
Basically, as you know, my role has been to provide holiday destinations.
So we've all been to Gibraltar.
Jeremy and Catriona came to see me in South America. I went to see Jeremy in Washington. Minouche and I lived in Washington at the same time recently.
Our children grew up together.
You keep us on a very, very good city lunch. City lunches at Schroders are absolutely magnificent.
So this is a kind of ongoing and permanent lifetime commitment, really.
So if you ask me what's the one thing I took away from LSE, it's nothing to do with economics, and it's all about friendship.
I agree with you.
There we are. That's a brilliant point to turn to the audience, who are also our friends. Right. Now, I'd like to take perhaps one or two. They don't have to be aimed at a particular individual. In fact, I'd rather have them treated as a team, to feel them as a team. So there's a man here, and a woman there. Yeah, so we'll take these two at least. Go for it.
Good evening. My name is David Lowry. I graduated in 1978, so a little bit earlier than you were at LSE. And I want to ask a question about something that the chair didn't steer you towards, but I think was interesting from my point of view. I came up from a small town in South Wales to the LSE as an 18-year-old. And it was the first time I really stayed away from home a long time. And I met a lot of people at the LSE, and I deliberately came to London because I wanted to be in a big city, not in a campus away from everywhere else. And I also knew that the LSE was close to other big things happening in the world, like Parliament, like the newspapers were just along the street in Fleet Street at the time. The TUC is not too far away, and so on. And one of the things that I really found interesting as a student here was that not only did you have formal lectures and informal meetings with other students, but we had lots of lectures given by people just passing through, either former students who, as the current director said, might have been a president or prime minister at the time, senior figures in other parts of industry, and also lots of people from Parliament. From at the time, the trade unions played a much bigger role. We had lots of trade union leaders coming through and giving talks and questions and answers and so on. And I just wondered whether, apart from your formal academic learning in economics, did you pick up any other things from the school because of its international nature, because of its interdisciplinary nature, that you took away and helped you to interpret the kind of things you now do? You talked about how economics was a good framework and it was a good way as a tool. But what about all the other things you picked up as people learning in a scholarly culture? What could have helped the way you then developed your careers?
Beautiful, elegant question. Thank you very much. Lady here.
My name's Professor Ruth Taplin, and I did my doctorate in economics in 1985. So one of the main themes that seems to be coming out from what you're saying, and my coming from a similar generation as you, is that what I really took away from LSE, and which I find reflected in your conversations, and I wanted to ask a further elaboration on this, is that what LSE seemed to always offer people studying here was a firm grounding in empirical evidence, that we must always look for empirical evidence to prove our hypotheses. And not only did we have to look for empirical evidence, but we also had to look beyond the boundaries of our disciplines. And it really set me on a path of interdisciplinary economics. I started a journal on this, and I write a lot of books on it. So what I was wondering is that since the more of the complexity, as you were saying, of data, cybersecurity, and all these things that perhaps we weren't so involved in then, it requires something far beyond econometrics and narrow disciplines. It really requires a deep interdisciplinary understanding and also a qualitative analysis as well. And I just wondered how you have developed among yourselves and your background at LSE how that has helped you in your careers and in your friendship.
Okay, that's that's really good questions. We'll take a third and then we'll pause, and then I'll take four, and I'm not going to take, I'll take four and then I'll pause. Go on, and I'll come back to you later, I promise.
Thank you. My name is David Sapphire. I'm probably older than many people in this room. I actually graduated with an MSc in Economics in 1970. I'm even older than I look. I really fascinated to hear some of the anecdotes, but even more interested to hear how and why people were attracted to LSE and comparing it to what happened in my day. I came here in 1966 and started with the BSc Econ. And the reason I came was because my economics teacher at school, who herself was in fact an LSE graduate, said, "It'll be perfect for you because you are the first derivative of a contrarian." I discovered that she was absolutely right. I was here at the time of storming the gates and all the other things which most of the panel were probably told by their parents should keep them away from LSE. When I got here, I discovered that the first lesson, the most important lesson, was that scarcity should be appreciated. And the way I applied that was that when 5 papers were recommended to be read after a lecture, I would immediately go to the library and take out the only one that hadn't been recommended, make sure that I kept it until the paper was written, and I usually ended up with a very good mark because nobody else had been able to get hold of that one. This was my first lesson in economics. I didn't realize it until much later. The second thing I discovered was that LSE was very, very much an attraction for people from all over the world. I still have, I'm delighted to say, friends, former alumni in probably 30 or 40 countries. I've lived in 4 or 5 countries myself, and many of my friends, in fact, have worked with many of you, but not as nearly as distinguished as all of you at the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. But my roommate at Parsfield Hall, in those days, forgive me the nostalgia, the only hall of residence that LSE actually had, was very concerned that if he failed to get 2-1 or better, he would be consigned by his government when he got back to Zambia to being only the Minister of Labour, whereas In fact, if he got a first, or a starred first, as he called it, he was determined that he would be the foreign minister. So, LSE actually did teach us the rules of imperfect competition as well. And the last comment, if I may make it, and it really is in the form of a question, because I'd be delighted to hear what your expectations, how your expectations were scotched if members of the panel came and discovered that LSE was very different to what they'd expected. I came here and ultimately studied the economics of education and human capital with then mere Richard Layard, who in those days didn't even know that happiness mattered, and he certainly hadn't discovered it yet. But many years later, at least 30 years later, I discovered that the reason I had really been interested in it was because it would lead me to get into the management of intellectual property and the economics of intellectual property. I didn't know that at the time. But since then, and I also went on to Chicago and did an MBA, I've discovered that the greatest attraction of all is actually in the title of a book written by Richard Thaler, who, as we know, is a great expert in behavioral economics. The most wonderful title, the most appealing title for a textbook ever, Misbehaving.
Right. Okay. I will pause there, and I'll come back to the others who've asked questions next. So feel free. This is all free-flowing, free-form. Respond as you'd like to. So we've got questions here about, in a sense, interdisciplinary work, the need for quantitative and qualitative research, the benefits of being a contrarian, and of course, a certain amount about the centrality of the location.
Yeah.
It's a pick and mix. Who'd like to pick or mix?
Well, I might just respond to the question about what was distinctive about coming here and the global. I mean, for me, I think coming to the LSE just did two things. It put me on a much more sort of excellent and demanding path, because the standards were so high, and I just was challenged and had to work incredibly hard. I always say the year I did my MSc in Economics was the year I worked the hardest in my life, and that just you showed yourself how much you could do. And the second thing is, it just was the most global place I'd ever been up until that point in my life. And so, the UK contingent was a real minority. Our class, we had 100 people completely from all over the world. And it was fantastic. I mean, I still remember the Italian students came to my little basement flat one day and taught me how to make a proper pasta. And it has to breathe, the pasta, and you can't put too much in the pot. And, there was those sort of wonderful experiences which I had never had before. And I think those were two really big impacts for me.
Very good.
I mean, I think the interdisciplinary thing is really interesting, although I have to say, when we were doing the Masters, we were so focused on the subject of understanding the course that we didn't really have much opportunity to bring that in. But the speaker program that is at LSE is something that I still go along to, and I think it's just fantastic.
Yeah.
And, you don't have to be able to go to Davos, I think, to get the speakers, because quite often the people going to Davos stop off at LSE and do the same talk.
Yeah.
So, you get a marvellous exposure.
Nicer environment here.
Yeah. One of the faculty members at the LSE said to me, "Oh, I don't travel anywhere anymore because everybody comes here." So,
Yeah, I think it is very true what Keith says, that the experience of being here was very focused, and if it wasn't in the talk course, you didn't tend to do it. And I think it's very different as an undergraduate here. I mean, obviously I'd lived in London for several years, so being in London wasn't a particular draw about the LSE. It was to do the course. I mean, I'd done a degree in history and economics at Oxford. I didn't really feel as though I knew much economics at the end of that, frankly. It's a very good university, obviously, but I came here to study economics, and so I could do my job better. And as you say, the real thing that was broadening out was not so much the speaker program or the interdisciplinary opportunities, which frankly we didn't take much advantage of. It was the breadth of the people on the course, which was so much more international and global than Oxford, so much more international than anything I'd ever experienced at school or obviously in my career in the civil service. That was the thing that was unique. But looking back on it, I think we probably didn't take advantage of all the opportunities, and it's only now you realise just what a brilliant speaker series you put on at the LSE. And I think, I don't know, maybe the master's course has developed since we did it, but if you want people to take on board other disciplines, you probably have to build them into the course
Yeah.
because people are so focused on actually just getting through the
Too
work.
focused.
It's just so tough to get through the work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I agree.
Catriona, do you want to add
Yeah,
anything?
well, because I was there for 2 years, and my first year was frankly a lot easier. The preliminary year, you're sort of just doing a sort of, I suppose, a little crash course in an economics degree. But in that year, I used to go to other lectures actually, and so I did get a flavour because I had lots of friends doing, you know, I don't know, sort of sociology, law, whatever. So I thought, actually, I'm here. Why don't I just actually go to some of these lectures? And that was amazing, actually, and got me, even then, thinking about the benefit of doing this in a more interdisciplinary way. And I was a little bit disappointed when the master's course started, and I had to give all that up because there just wasn't enough time to do it. So, but the second point is, the other students on the course, I mean, we got together as a little study group, but obviously we mixed with everybody else, and there was the Greek contingent, the Italian contingent, and everyone had their own little groups, and you got to sample their food and everything. And it was a lot of fun, actually. I mean, there was some great people on that course.
Okay, just given you spent so much time in Africa, what do people in Africa, I'm sorry, it's a big question, people you talk to when you're in postings in Africa, I mean, many of them do come to the school. I mean, what's the picture of the LSE you receive in different countries within Africa?
We have this amazing program. One of us has, you've probably heard of the Achieving program, which is a one-year master's course, which is fully funded. And it's incredibly good course and very in demand. And there's a number of LSE alumni in Zimbabwe. And we've actually set up a little Russell group, but one of the most kind of enthusiastic group are the LSE group, actually. So a number have studied here and have gone on to doing amazing jobs in their home country in both public and private sector. Yeah, so it has a fantastic reputation, very prestigious, and those who've been to LSE are extremely proud of having been here.
I mean, I'm going to answer that question in a slightly different way.
Go on.
So I was posted, as Minouche says, High Commissioner to Pakistan, and in Pakistan there's an Oxford and Cambridge Society, and traditionally the honorary president of the society is the British High Commissioner, and there's a Pakistani elite. Anyway, I arrived, and this probably 75, 80-year-old Pakistani who'd studied at Cambridge came up to me and said, well, the High Commissioner is always the honorary president, so I assume you'll take that on. I said, yes, of course. He said, so which college were you at? So I said, well, I was at Warwick University for my undergraduate degree, and then I just stopped, and his face was a picture, and I think he was thinking, can I tell the incoming British High Commissioner that actually we're going to change the rules and not have him as president? And I waited a little bit and let him kind of dangle, and I said, but I did my master's at LSE, and he thought that was just about okay, and he made me the honorary president. So, LSE has cachet.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, let's go back to the audience now. Some more questions. Yes, 1, 2 here. We'll do 2 together and right at the back there. So keep the microphone at the back, and then we'll do 2 here with 1 microphone. So we'll just do 1, 2, and then 3 at the back. Yes, go for it. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity and for this lovely evening. Many of the things that the panel has shared resonated very much with me. My name is Abdullah Fathi. I'm from the United Arab Emirates, which gives me great pleasure, of course, to be here in the Sheikh Zayed Theatre, always. And I had some questions to ask with regards to your experience here at LSE. Shortly after graduating from the International Relations Department with a master's, I went to do my diplomatic training at the UAE Embassy here in London, which is a great fan of the LSE because many of the diplomats came from LSE, and I don't know if there's a requirement to go to LSE in order to make it there, but it's a very close relationship they have with LSE, of course, through the Emirates Foundation as well. And I had a conversation with the ambassador at the time, who said to me, what do you aspire to become when you're older? You're obviously here. And I said, I wanted to become a diplomat. I want to represent the nation, be a statesman. And he said, as you were saying, well, if you want to serve your country, the best thing you can do is serve the economy. And there are many things we as diplomats cannot do to help our economy by virtue of the foreign ministry's structure and the formality that comes with the people that we deal with, and there's limited information that can actually come to us because of our occupation. So why don't you find a way to become an ambassador for our country, except, as he called it, a civil ambassador? You don't have to be in the foreign ministry to become an ambassador. You represent your nation wherever you go, in whatever field you do. So they endorsed me, and then subsequently the LSE has endorsed me to start a trade investment agency here, which I've called Emirates Trade Investment, modeled after UKTI, which is now the DIT. And we're building a portal to allow the British and UAE counterparts come together to invest in each other's economies and represent the ones that don't have offices or setups in either countries here together, and working very closely with DIT. Mr. Philip mentioned that what he got from the LSE upon graduation, in the short term perhaps was an economics education, in the long term was friendship. Similarly, I think I was very privileged to know exactly what I wanted to do when I came to the LSE as a master's student, so I spent most of my time pursuing that and working very closely with the Department of International Relations, the IGA, the Middle East Center, as well as the Director's Office at the time, to come to this point that I'm at. Upon graduation, the LSE and the alumni community have not been very easy to reach in order to build upon what is a global community that I think can one day be a global society, where we're all very much intact. What can the LSE and its alumni do further to support graduates coming out of the LSE, particularly ones that are very ambitious, visionary, and looking to serve their communities and their countries with direct consistency with British interests and the LSE's interests? Because today, if I go to the library to use a computer, the alumni computers don't even have Microsoft Office package because there's no license for them. So in many ways, as a graduate from the LSE, I feel neglected, that I'm not quite welcome at the LSE anymore. So
Well, we pick those questions up perhaps now and after as well. So if I just move on to the lady behind and at the back as well, so everybody gets a chance. Okay, thank you very much.
Elizabeth Stamen. I did a diploma in business studies, 1988. And actually, I wanted to underline also what came up in terms of themes, the interdisciplinary nature of the LSE. I was lucky enough, so diploma in business studies was economics, accounting and finance, and I could choose international relations and in organizational theory. The other thing which I could really relate to is what Minouche said about the LSE being so international, having come from Germany, having never been exposed to such an international place. It was an eye-opener, and I always made a point, for example, not to stick around with the German crowd, but always have lunch, go to the pub with people from all kinds of places. The question I had for the panel is, and Jeremy alluded to it a little bit, is what your engagement with the LSE is, and to what extent the LSE engages with you, and perhaps if you could give some advice to the LSE. I'm a member of Court and Council, Deputy Chair of the Finance Committee, and I know alumni relations is something which is very close to our heart and which I think the LSE want to do a better job at. So what advice would you give to the LSE, what they could do better in terms of engaging with alumni?
Okay, great. And then right at the back. Yes.
My name is Laing. I came to LSE in 1960, before nearly everyone here was born. I think LSE took me on as an experiment, which meant, of course, that I never had to make it work. But my degree from LSE in the government gave me a foundation from which I could work. I qualified as a librarian, which was completely the wrong thing for someone with difficult speech. However, I ended up as a senior research officer in the Civil Aviation Authority. My writing rather than papers on the economics of aviation, which was a long way for government. But what I want to ask you is, how can somebody with no name behind it get the government to read letters? Because the last 4 administrations have been saying that more disabled people should go to work, and the way they want to encourage this is to take away benefits. And I would love to be able to convince somebody who matters that it takes 2 parties to get work. You have to have someone willing to work and someone else willing to give them a job. And my experience is that an awful lot of employers do not want to take the risk of appointing a disabled applicant, and I write letter after letter, and nobody reads them. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, now. One more? Okay, all right, yes, go on. Sorry? Okay, wait for the microphone, otherwise you won't be able to.
I came to the LSE in 1956.
Microphone?
When an awful lot of us came directly from our national service. And what I wanted just to say, the atmosphere in this place at that time was enormously exciting. I loved this place, and it changed my life and my direction, and I owe it everything. I didn't do as well here as my son did. Got a brilliant first, but he came here because I came here. And I just wanted to say that this was one of the happiest moments of my life.
Oh, that's nice.
Well, yet again, I mean, I'm going to ask my esteemed colleagues, panel friends here to react to what you've just, the various remarks and comments you've just heard.
So can I respond to the gentleman of the United Arab Emirates, and particularly the advice he was given by his previous ambassador? And with respect to, I'm not sure that's certainly not the advice I would give somebody thinking of joining the British Foreign Office, because I don't think you can make a distinction in such a clear way between kind of foreign policy and domestic and economic issues. I think it is fundamental to a lot of work that we do internationally, whether that's from the Foreign Office or from bits of the British government that engage internationally from other departments, is an understanding of economics. So I think I think economics is useful in diplomacy, and so I just wanted to say that. And I think my example would be, if you want to negotiate a trade deal with another country, and this is very germane. Absolutely, you need people who understand trade policy and really understand the trade impacts on your own country. But you also need people who understand the politics and the political economy, to go back earlier, of the country you're trying to do a deal with, and understand that actually, if you want to move them on this, there's going to be this constituency against it, voting against it in Parliament or whatever. Has the right people and the right contacts to influence and so on. So I think economics and diplomacy are really intertwined.
And I might just respond on how the LSE engages with alumni. So I don't know if you guys remember, we came to an alumni event more than like 10 years ago. Do you remember that?
You can get away with saying this, Minouche, because I can't.
Okay, it was a bit of a disaster, to be Do you remember?
No, I don't know.
You better tell everybody now, because he doesn't
We were very cross
remember.
at the time, and then we went out because there wasn't enough food and there wasn't enough drink, and we went out for supper afterwards. Do you remember?
I do remember that.
It was not a great
Went down to the
occasion.
Waldorf for a drink.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So I would like to do a better job than that going forward. There is this issue about bringing alumni together to network and reminisce and find old friends, and that's very important. I think there's also something distinctive about LSE alumni. So people who come to the LSE do not come here for the college balls and punting on the river. That's not what we're about. They do come for being in an exciting global intellectual community. And I think that is the way I think we can connect most with the alumni of this place. Whenever I travel and I go and meet hundreds of alumni in all sorts of countries, we have 200 alumni groups around the world, I would like them to feel that they're still connected to this global intellectual community, and that once you come to the LSE, you are part of the coolest intellectual club in the world. And being able to maintain that engagement on the issues of the day. I mean, people who come to the LSE care about the issues of the day. They want to know what the latest research on important topics is. And I think if we can find a way to share that so people feel like they've got this alternative source of intellectual engagement, I think that would be great. And the other thing I should mention is, some of you may have seen this huge construction site in the middle of campus. That is the new centre building, which will house our new School of Public Policy and Government and International Relations. But on the ground floor, there will be an alumni centre, and it will be a place where all alumni can come. There'll be coffee, there'll be computers, there'll be reading material, and it will be a place where everybody will be welcome. So I hope that will be a change.
Absolutely, and if I can add an advert for the School of Public Policy, which we're in the process of creating, well, look at competitive advertising for different parts of the school. We will be on the 5th floor of this excellent building, and I'm also committed, I'm hoping that I can convince my successor to be convinced, to have space there for distinguished fellows and others, some of whom will be alumni, some who won't, from government in the UK, government outside the UK, private sector and so on, who can also gather, and where students can then take advantage of their expertise in practice in real time. And that's something else we will be able to do in this wonderful new building, which now has floors, and some of it's got windows. So it's really, it's growing fast.
Can I just extend the point that Elizabeth made, not to relations, not between the school and alumni particularly, but between the school and government. Because I think, obviously we are, 4 of us anyway, 3 of us are in government. And I have long felt that the LSE, given its expertise, does not have anywhere near enough influence over government thinking. And I think we're very much beholden to think tanks and relatively young people coming straight out of college rather than deep academic experts and so on. We need a mix of both, obviously. Now the brilliant Rosanna Chowdhury has done some fantastic work in trying to forge closer links between the British government and the LSE, but I think that's still very much work in progress. I think your blogs are getting more and more relevant to what we're trying to do, and I think that is becoming an increasingly useful resource. And the School of Government, obviously, or Public Policy, will be a very big step forward as well. But it's still remarkable how little contact there is, in a sense, between the world-class academics and research students here and what's going on in the civil service. When we're crying out for evidence-based policy, for new thinking, the country's got loads and loads of challenges. We need fresh thinking, but there still isn't that real tight connection between a brilliant place like this in the heart of London and the civil service and government generally.
I mean, there is a bit of an initiative going on about this, as you probably know, the Institute for Government. We love them. They are looking at this issue as we speak, and I think there's an event coming up in a couple of weeks' time which Chris Wormold is speaking at. We're trying to, because the different, there is a problem with the different timescales, pressures, demands, and many of those things can be sorted out. But you need, in the sense that there needs to be an analysis of why there are obstacles, and not just for the LSE really, in order to make it work better. But anyway, it is work in progress.
Just 2 things on the alumni thing. I mean, I live quite near Cambridge, and so I see what they do with their alumni and things. And I don't think we really leverage the alumni network in the way that other universities do at all, particularly the international network. I mean, I travel a lot for my work and go to Asia, and there's always, I mean, lots of LSE grads and students, some of them are Schroders, others in the financial markets. But, you know, you sometimes think, well, there's something that LSE could do to leverage that. The other thing is that, you know, I think there should be almost an audit of the skills that the alumni have to be able to use those to help further some of the aims of the LSE. I mean, the appeal with Cambridge is that they can appeal to people and say, look, we've been around for 800 years and it's your responsibility to make sure we can continue to do that. So they pull the alumni in. I don't see LSE really doing that as much as it perhaps could. I think the alumni network's improved enormously in the last few years, but I think there's still quite a lot more to do.
Yeah. I wanted to respond to the important question from the back, the back row. Both, I mean, obviously, you know, I don't know about your particular case, and I think if I've understood you right, you were saying you were having trouble getting responses to letters. I mean, my advice on the practicalities of that would be to talk to your local MP, are often a good way of making sure the government does respond to replies. But I also think you raised quite an important wider issue where I think there is possibly a role for LSE, and that is about work, because you said very rightly that for somebody to have a job, it needs two sides. You need the person who wants to work, you need the person willing to give work. And if I reflect on my lifetime, apart from probably the internet, the thing that's changed the most and is going to carry on changing a lot is work in a really quite fundamental ways I don't think we've worked out yet. And it's going to be about how we make sure everyone has the opportunity for work, how long they're going to work for, how they're rewarded in an affordable way. So I think, taking your question as a spur, I think there's quite a big public policy space there where LSE and your expertise can really help what is a kind of a new frontier.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we're coming up to 8:30. I'm going to finish on time, but I'd just like to ask each of our friends here gathered. There's one final thought, short and sharp final thought, before a glass of wine, that is, that they'd like to sort of leave us with this evening about the school or your experience at the school or what the school should do next or something linked to the LSE and or personally. Right, it's cruel now. This is like those TV programs. Who's going to go?
I mean, ready. Particularly profound, but I would just say get involved. Because we talked a bit about the great speakers that come here and what have you, and I think this is an opportunity that you have to really hear, some of the world's greatest thinkers and get involved. But also, when you go along to those kind of meetings and lectures, you mix with people who are probably in a similar field or like-minded. You may end up working in that field in the future. You never quite know what it would lead to. But if you don't actually get involved, you will never find out. So,
great. Catriona.
Yeah, well, I think it's, again, if I had my time again, even though there was huge pressure on the master's course, I would have continued what I did in the first year, which was take advantage of all the other lectures and activities that are going on. And the second thing is, do retain your friendship groups and your wider networks, and don't be ashamed to network shamelessly.
That's going to start again in a minute, don't worry.
How you get on in life.
Very good. Philip.
So for me, and probably I would say this, seeing as I'm from the Foreign Office, for me it is about the international connections, and I think those are only going to be more important to us in future. I think they're personified in this room, they're personified on our course. I think they're personified in the faculty here. Minouche kindly invited me to an event last year where the Prime Minister of Pakistan came over and announced funding for a new chair, but that happened because of a Pakistani alum, but also because of the Pakistani society here. And so I think the international and making sure that's as cherished as it can be is the key for me. Okay, good.
I'm going to hop over to Jeremy so Minouche can have the last word. Okay. Double pressure. Jeremy.
Well, just apart from reiterating what a great privilege it was to be here and what an immense pleasure it was and how many lifelong friends I made, I would just go back to my last point, really. I think the LSE has got to be relevant to today's issues. It can't just be an academic, it can't just live on its academic reputation and just theory. It has to be engaged on the issues that face the world today, the government today. and it needs to sort of reach out to policymakers if it's going to retain that relevance. I think, personally, you know, if I look at my kids, they are sort of more au fait with current affairs than I was, certainly age 14 and 16, and I think kids will just demand that, you know, when they're spending, you know, a whole year of their lives, or let alone 3 years of their lives, they're going to come out of it with some actually usable material, usable knowledge that is relevant to today's world.
Great. Minouche.
I guess what I'd say is, if you had told us 32 years ago that we would be sitting here,
I know, it's bizarre.
It's completely bizarre, and we would have never dreamed, A, that we would still be friends, B, that we'd be sitting here at the LSE again, sounding rather authoritative and on stage as opposed to taking notes in a panic behind the stage. So I guess my final thought is just, you never know where life takes you. And be good to everyone along the way, because they may still be a part of your life many years later.
Very good. Well, I know where life's going to take us next, which is out for a friendly drink and some networking. I'd just like to say it's been a fun evening. I think it's great to share in other people's friendship, history, and accumulated knowledge. That's a great privilege for all of us, I think, and thank you for that. I think we've learned one or two things that can be done better, some of them inside the school, some about how economics is changing. We've learned other things, I think, about the merits of understanding why international connectedness is an important element in the world. And if public policy has failed, it's clearly failed, at least in part, not to get that message across, or to fail to get it across to enough people to understand that the more there is interconnectedness, the fewer problems there will be in the world as a generality, and that's a very important thing. So we live in complex and interesting times, and if they weren't complex, there'd be nothing to study. So thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to thank our excellent group of friends and panel, and we can all meet again outside in a couple of minutes to chatter further. So thank you all very much.